On a humid Mississippi night in 1973, two men said something impossible happened beside the river. A silent craft, a blinding light, and figures that seemed to move with purpose. What did they really encounter out there? Pascagoula was a working Gulf Coast town, shaped by shipyards, fishing, and long stretches of water and marsh. It was the kind of place where an unusual story could travel fast, but only if people believed the witnesses were sincere. That evening, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were fishing after work, a routine outing that should have ended quietly. Instead, they later described a sequence so strange that it still sits uneasily in the record. Their account begins with an object they said hovered above the water, not flashing like a plane, and not drifting like a balloon. It was described as metallic, oval, and unnervingly controlled. Then came the detail that made the story unforgettable. A bright opening and a sensation of being taken aboard without warning. In their telling, the experience was not a dreamlike blur, but a sequence of clear, frightening moments. Inside, they claimed, the environment felt cold and clinical, with a strange hum and figures that seemed neither fully human nor fully mechanical. The contrast between the ordinary riverbank and that impossible interior is what keeps the case alive. What makes the Pascagoula case linger is not just the claim itself, but the way the two men reacted afterward. They were visibly shaken, and the story spread before either of them had time to shape it into something polished. Police interviews followed, and investigators noted that the witnesses were emotional, confused, and consistent on several central points. That consistency did not settle the matter, but it did make the account hard to dismiss casually. One of the most compelling details is the timing. The men said the encounter happened in a narrow window. Late enough to feel isolated, early enough that the night was still active around them. That matters in cases like this. Another detail is the physical aftermath they described: fear, exhaustion, and a lingering sense that something had happened to them. Whether or not every part of the story can be verified, the emotional residue was not theatrical. It seemed raw. Soon the case drew attention far beyond Mississippi, helped by the fact that the witnesses did not fit the usual stereotype of attention seekers. They were local men with ordinary lives, which made the claim feel harder to place. The story also gained a second layer when one of the men later underwent a lie detector test, which supporters have long pointed to as meaningful. Even so, such tests measure stress, not truth itself, and they never end the argument. Then there was the question of why the encounter was remembered so differently from a simple sighting. A light in the sky can be forgotten. A close encounter with missing time and physical terror becomes something else entirely. Supporters of the extraordinary interpretation say the case feels different because the men seemed overwhelmed rather than performative. Their reactions, they argue, fit a real intrusion into daily life more than a carefully invented tale. Skeptics, however, point to the pressures that can shape memory after a frightening event, especially when alcohol, fatigue, and shock may be involved. From that angle, the account could be a human story that grew in the telling. Even so, the central oddity remains the same. Both men described the same sequence, the same craft, and the same strange beings without an obvious script to follow. That shared structure is part of why the case still draws attention. The setting itself adds weight. A river edge at night gives you darkness, distance, and the sense that something could appear and vanish before anyone else arrives. Pascagoula offered exactly that kind of stage. As the story moved into newspapers and radio, the case stopped being only local folklore and became part of a larger American pattern. People began comparing it with other close encounter claims from the same era. That wider context matters because the early 1970s were full of reports of strange lights, military secrecy, and public distrust. Pascagoula landed in a moment when the sky already felt contested. Yet the case never depended on atmosphere alone. It hinged on whether the witnesses were describing a true encounter, a shared misperception, or something in between that still resists neat categories. A particularly hard-to-ignore detail is how ordinary the beginning was. There was no dramatic setup, no chase, no ritual expectation, just fishing after work, then a sudden break in reality. That ordinariness is exactly why the claim has endured. Extraordinary stories are easier to set aside when they arrive wrapped in spectacle, but this one begins in a place most people can picture. Investigators later had to weigh a familiar problem in cases like this. Memory under stress can sharpen some details and blur others, but the witnesses' insistence on the same core sequence kept the mystery from fading. There were also reports of a third person briefly entering the story, which added confusion rather than clarity. In cases of this kind, every new witness can either strengthen the record or complicate it further. The strongest believer case rests on the combination of sincerity, consistency, and the sheer strangeness of the described encounter. Taken together, those elements make Pascagoula feel less like a rumor and more like an unresolved event. Still, the conventional readings remain important. Misidentification, stress, alcohol, and the amplifying effect of local attention all offer ways the story could have grown beyond what actually happened that night. Even those explanations leave a residue of uncertainty because they do not fully explain the level of detail the men repeated over time. A simple mistake usually frays at the edges. This account held its shape, and that is where Pascagoula becomes more than a local oddity. It becomes a test of how we handle testimony when the event is intimate, brief, and almost impossible to photograph in the moment. What was seen in the sky, if anything, may never be fully recoverable. But the human side of the case, the fear, the confusion, the certainty that something happened, remains stubbornly present. That human side is why the story still resonates with people who follow unexplained aerial cases. It asks whether the most important evidence is always physical, or whether lived experience can carry its own weight. Pascagoula leaves us with a narrow set of possibilities, none of them entirely comfortable. Something extraordinary may have intruded on an ordinary evening, or two frightened men may have crossed into a shared misreading of events. Either way, the case survives because it refuses to collapse into a single neat answer. The river is still there, the town is still there, and the question still hangs in the humid air.